So today's presentation is on Ibn Rushd, the philosopher of Cordoba, Abu al-Walid Muhammad ibn Ahmad ibn Rushd, if you want to ever call him by his full name. And particularly with focus on the work you're dealing with, which is on the harmony of philosophy and religion. At least that's George Hourani's translation that you're working with. As you'll see in the presentation today, focus is not actually the full title of the work, right? And the aims of the lectures, I have them there for you, really is just to introduce you to the kind of general context from which philosophy is being addressed here by Ibn Rushd, and I think you've already encountered some of the approach to address the place and role in philosophy with Al-Ghazali already, right, in this kind of Arab-Islamic tradition, and to introduce you to some of the key concerns of Al-Ghazali and key ideas that he will be raising in the text you are encountering. A very important remark is, and I'll come back to this again later on, you're not reading one of Ibn Rushd's philosophical works, you're reading one of Ibn Rushd's works on philosophy, right? And that's a key distinction to keep in mind, right? I'll come back to it, so, but just for now, keep it in mind. Before we launch into a focused presentation on the author himself and the work you're dealing with, I ask you to indulge me with a little kind of digression. I usually say it's a brief digression, but I know that's actually it's not brief, but indulge me anyway. Because to fully understand where Ibn Rushd is coming from in this text, and to fully understand his concerns and the key issues he's addressing, one needs to place it in its historical content, right? He is concerned with addressing the place and role of philosophy, but obviously this is not an issue that suddenly arises in Al-Andalus in his time. This is a long-standing issue. And so I think it's very, very helpful if we take a step back, just a few centuries, not much, and just briefly look at the entry of philosophy into the Arab-Islamic world, and then take it from there. And when I use the term philosophy, really this is not some fluid term of, you know, I'm not falsaf. Tafalsuf was actually the term they used, but this is specifically Greek philosophy. Not as opposed to anything else, because the word philosophy is a Greek word that the Arabs transliterated into falsafa, right? So we're talking about philosophia, the Greek heritage. And normally we would place that entry point in the 8th century AD, 2nd century Hijri, Baghdad, right? Normally that's where we would place it. Not like, you know, philosophy comes in and says hello, but rather that with the expansion of the Arab-Islamic empire, you know, the early century of expansionism into the 2nd century, obviously a lot of various cultures, very diverse backgrounds, very diverse histories come to be under the umbrella of what we now call the Islamicate, by the way, if you ever want to reference the kind of the Islamic world, not in the religious strictly sense, but in the socio-political and religious sense of the time, the Islamicate. Including, of course, you know, all of the, what we now call, you know, the North African part, into the South European part, all the way down, of course, to, you know, the other side of Persia and whatnot, and up to Europe. So within that expansion, of course, came in a lot of the heritage of the pre-Islamic eras in these cultures and these worlds, whether the Indo-Persian, whether the Greek. And it was very interesting time that the governors themselves, particularly the Khulafa, right, the Caliph, became themselves very interested in studying and in translating these discovered kind of various heritages in books and texts. Partly, of course, because it makes sense as a socio-political concern. If you want to properly govern, you have to understand what you're governing, right? But there was actually a genuine interest into what these works, into what these other cultures have done in terms of science and philosophy, etc., because, of course, the quest for knowledge is very much within the context of an Islamic mindset, if you wish. Now we're talking about, you know, that era. And so in the 8th century, Baghdad, and, you know, into the 9th century, we actually call it the golden age of Baghdad, or the, you know, the greatest age, or whatever, al-Asr al-Dhahabi. And there was an immense movement of translation, of studies, of commentaries on works, Indo-Persian as well as Greek, but specifically with a lot of the Greek sciences and Greek philosophical works, right? And in this context, please, whenever we use the word philosophy, that also includes natural philosophy, i.e. science. The distinctions between chemistry, physics, biology, that's going to wait till the 19th century. So when you speak of science, and from your encounter with Al-Ghazali, I hope you already saw that. He includes, of course, natural philosophy there amongst mathematics, politics, and whatnot. So there was an immense interest of studying and translating these works, as I said, under the patronage of the political powers, right? The Caliph himself was interested, was sponsoring this. And for instance, in Baghdad, they set up something we call, Bayt al-Hikmah, if you're familiar with it, House of Wisdom, where, it was like basically a library and a discussion place. And we're told that even the Caliph himself would join in on Tuesdays when he could to, engage in discussion on Aristotle or Ptolemy or Galen or in the various medical sciences, philosophical sciences, etc. These are not illuminations from the era itself, but they cover more or less, right? So for instance, you see, when we talk about philosophy and science, as I said, there's obvious study of marine biology there, right? Very focused. These group of guys on this side, they're doing mathematics and geometry, handasa, right? And obviously as well as astronomy, which of course still is closely connected with astrology, right? But it was really, again, the study of the universe and whatnot. All of this taking place side by side in harmony with the religious sciences, right? And there was really no one at the time, especially, for instance, we mentioned Abu Yusuf al-Kindi, for instance, who's one of the early falasifa. In fact, the first to receive the title Falasuf al-Arab. There's no kind of tension between, Greek philosophy or this philosophical heritage and the Islamic sciences, right? And these are distinct, by the way, and they distinguish them at the time. They, the new sciences, the ulum, al-Islamiyya, al-ulum al-jadida, and the old sciences, the ancient sciences, al-qadima, right? So for instance, fiqh, right? Jurisprudence, tafsir, exegesis, interpretation, all of these are counted within the Islamic sciences, right? Ilm al-kalam, obviously. And then you have, natural philosophy or logic, mantiq, or they were counted amongst the ancient sciences, al-ulum al-qadima. Bottom line, that was the age. That was, and this is why many people speak of the golden age, right? But for whatever reason, and of course you can go into all different theories, what happens, what doesn't happen, the tide changes and moves against the ulama, in this sense, the scientists and the falasifa, particularly with the tension between two of the main schools of the kalam at the time, al-Mu'tazila and the Asha'ira, right? You familiar when I use these terminology, by the way? Okay. I hope you did a bit of that with Al-Ghazali. I can't do much more here. Yes, sir. No. No. Yes. The Sufis, they're, if you wish, an additional layer of the time, right? But they're definitely not within the debate of the Mu'tazila and the Ash'ara, definitely. But they had their own debate, so yeah, Abu Hallaj and others. But the main point is, so the Mu'tazila school, very, very briefly, the Mu'tazila school of Kalam and Ilm al-Kalam was the closest to, if you wish, this rationalistic, I wouldn't say philosophy, but definitely the rationalistic approach that in debates of religion one uses reason, right? To answer questions about the divine, about free will. And so, for instance, they fully believed in free will. They fully believed in your acts will lead to certain, circumstances depending on what you do or what not. Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari, he was a Mu'tazila himself, so he was from the school. But then he moved and turned against them, right? Not in that, he went to non-rationalism, but he toned it down, so to speak. And he took a different approach, which is, no, there are certain issues, discussions, and questions where reason cannot answer. And I hope you see this very clearly with his student, Al-Ghazali, right? The work you've already read from Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali. So with Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari and then Al-Ghazali, the tide turns. Is it necessarily their fault? I don't know, right? Some people would like to claim, Haram, that Abu Hamid is the whole problem. I don't know. Ibn Rushd certainly thinks he's part of the problem, right? But irrespective of the impact of people like Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari or Al-Ghazali themselves, the fact is that around the 10th century, i.e. around the time that Al-Ghazali was writing, yes, the tide was certainly changing against the presence of philosophy and natural science in Baghdad, in the eastern part of the Arab Islamic world. And after Al-Ghazali, there's really very few people you can name in terms of, natural philosophers or philosophers. Not that they disappear, but it seems that the focus now shifts to Al-Andalus. It shifts to North Africa and Spain. So at the same time as that was happening in the Arab eastern part of the world, in the western part of the Islamic Empire, a different story was unfolding, right? Well, on some level, a similar story. There was also tension. There was also, at one point, antagonism against falsafa and against, natural sciences and kind of more religiosity, not religion, religiosity. But then the tide changed around the mid-1100s towards a more positive appropriation and appreciation of the study of philosophy and natural philosophy. And in fact, there was a conscious effort by the rulers of Al-Andalus, right, Islamic Spain, i.e. in North Africa, to rival the great days of Baghdad. They wanted to outdo Baghdad, right? And so they set up their own version of the House of Wisdom, the great Bayt al-Hikmah. They do even more translation, even more studying, and in fact, it's a report, and by the way, they import stuff from Baghdad where it's becoming kind of, either burnt or ignored at some points, and so they import it to their part of the world, and they set up what was at the time one of the greatest reference libraries in the world, supposedly around 400, 500,000 manuscripts. At the time, that's a lot. Not books, yeah, but manuscripts, still very impressive. Phenomenal work in architecture and art, phenomenal work in the sciences. And normally, after Al-Ghazali, and this is cliche, I know, but it simplifies, it helps. After Al-Ghazali, if you want to start to think of Arab Islamic philosophers, you start to think of Ibn Rushd, Ibn Tufayl, Ibn Bajjah, Ibn Khaldun. And all of them are in that part of the world, right? Again, that is not to say nothing was happening in the other part, but it was a bit quieter, let's say. And it's within this context yet you encounter now Ibn Rushd, right? So if a similar story to the patronage from the political powers and the direct support that kind of really boosted up the study of science and philosophy in the Arab Islamic East, a similar story also boosted it up in the Arab Islamic West. In fact, it was such a conscious effort that they also had this idea of recruiting scientists and philosophers. And that's, for instance, how Ibn Rushd came into court, right? Al-Bilad. Are you familiar with Ibn Tufayl? Okay. Lovely man. Let me just tell you that. I don't know, actually. I never met him. But he was one of the key figures of the time. And just to give you an idea of how serious they were in supporting and sponsoring philosophy and science, right? Part of his role was to identify new talent, a lot like what football clubs do these days, right? They have scouts. They kind of identify new talent and they grab them. And he's the one who actually brought in Ibn Rushd. He introduced him to the ruler of the time. So Abu Yusuf Yaqub, who was governor at the time, was actually interested in trying to understand Aristotle. If any of you have encountered Aristotle, you know that can be a bit challenging sometimes. And so he turns to Ibn Tufayl and he says, help me out. If you can write a commentary or anything that will clarify and help me make sense of Aristotle. Ibn Tufayl at the time was busy writing his most famous work, Hayy ibn Yaqdan. And so he says, well, actually, I'm kind of busy now, but I know someone who might be the right person for this. And he brings in Abul Walid ibn Rushd. So this was a conscious time of engaging in philosophy, in science, etc. And this is the tone you will find in Ibn Rushd's work as you're reading it. The added layer, however, is that Ibn Rushd is writing this at a time when he's starting to be concerned with two main things. Injuries, as he says, done to philosophy by those who actually are in philosophy, and injuries done to religion by those who are working within the religious realm. So, in brief, and to jump to introduce our author, Ibn Rushd's work, the one you're reading, has in mind two main things. This is not just a question of, let me show you why philosophy is so important, right? This is actually, in that context of supporting philosophy, there was also at the same time some skepticism about the place and role in philosophy, that it could perhaps lead astray, as Abu Hamid would have us think, for instance. And Ibn Rushd needs to address both these concerns. He's very, very aware of the importance and centrality of philosophy and natural science, but he does actually also need to keep in mind that there has been some errors, as you will see, and some issues that he needs to address, both committed by the falasifa as well as those such as Abu Hamid, who are opposing the falasifa. Okay? Because when I said the political powers were sponsoring the study of philosophy and science, let's be just very, very clear on something. Not for the public, right? This was a private affair. So, whereas the rulers and the governors may engage with Al-Kindi in Baghdad or would engage with Ibn Rushd in Cordoba, this is not to say this was a public affair, right? Nonetheless, the discussions and the impact of philosophical discussions were becoming a public affair by the fact, for instance, that Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, has explicitly and openly charged the falasifa with kufr, right? Now, unbelief is not exactly a light claim that you can level against anyone, right? So Ibn Rushd now is writing with all of this backdrop in mind, the backdrop of the heightened interest in philosophy in the Arab Islamic East, but then the decline, the rise of the interest in the western part of the empire, but now a bit of hesitance, a bit of skepticism, and a bit of challenges. So much so that at one point he chose exile, right? Because at one point, even in Cordoba, the tide changed. The tide turned against the philosophical mindset that someone like Ibn Rushd represents, and he actually dies in exile. He dies in Marrakesh, where he actually first met Ibn Tufayl. So, with that background loosely placed out there as a digression, biographies, you can always read them online, they're all over the place. But I do want to just emphasize one thing now to introduce the author and then jump to the text. Ibn Rushd is not, I mean, nowadays if you say somebody is a philosopher, we're not too sure what that means. I don't know, what do they do, right? Maybe they're an academic, etc. Ibn Rushd is not simply a philosopher in that kind of specific sense, right? Philosophy or philosophers at the time meant they were basically scientists, they were mathematicians, they were, okay, so he was engaged in all realms of seeking knowledge, philosophia, right? The seeking of wisdom. And he was also a doctor. He was actually the court doctor to the rulers at the time, so he was the physician. And he was, and please don't ever forget this, high judge. He was the chief judge of Cordoba, right? Judge in what sense? Not a civil law. There's no civil law. This is religious law. Qadi Shara. Right? So at one point he was judge, and then at one point he was appointed as chief judge of Cordoba. So this is someone who is in his own being, right, in his own person, if you wish, a representation of the coexistence, of the harmony between philosophy and religion, as George Horani chooses to translate the title. Right? He is himself one of the leading philosophers of his time, one of the leading Aristotelian philosophers of his time. He is a doctor. He is a high judge, a chief judge. He is also writing about mathematics, writing about astronomy. He is actually one of the first to present a critique on Ptolemy's theory of the universe, if you're familiar with it. If you're not, it's fine. Yeah. So that's the Ibn Rushd that you're reading. You're not reading Ibn Rushd, the philosopher. And the distinction I'm trying to make here is this is not, what you're reading is not one of Ibn Rushd's philosophical works. This is his work to defend the place and role of philosophy in an Islamic monotheistic context. It has a very specific aim, and you can see from the beginning he's writing not so much as a philosopher defending philosophy, but as a judge, right? Although he, of course, wears both hats, okay? So keep this in mind, and keep in mind that he is writing with a very clear sense of urgency. He is concerned. He is concerned that if the tide turns enough against falsafa and against the pursuit of philosophy, this is not harmful for philosophy, this is harmful for religion, right? And this is his main aim. This is what he wants to show in this text. Good? So the title of the text, as I said, the translation you're reading on the harmony of philosophy and religion, but the actual title of the text is The Decisive Treatise Determining the Nature of the Connection Between Philosophy and Religion. That's usually how it's translated. The Arabic, however, is more fluid. It's كتاب فصل المقال وتقرير ما بين الحكمة والشريعة من اتصال. No, there's no mention of philosophy in the title that Ibn Rushd writes. There's mention of hikmah, right? Which is the aim of philosophy. Philosophy is not an end in itself, right? Wisdom, sagesse, hikmah is the end of philosophy, right? And so what Ibn Rushd wants to say in his title, that there's a direct connection, a very clear connection between hikmah wa sharia, right? The religious law and the aim of philosophy, wisdom. Good? So, as the title suggests, it's pretty clear. This is a work where he's going to show you the connection between these two, right? So how does he start off? He says, look, the first question to ask is, what is the attitude of the law, religious law? And whenever you read the term law or hear the term law with Ibn Rushd, this is religious law. There's no other law that he's referencing, right? So what is the attitude of the law towards philosophy? The attitude, in other words, the law usually either forbids something, allows something, or commands it. Right? This is a religious question. So this is what I meant. He's approaching it not as a philosopher, but as a qadi. He's raising a very legal question. Does religious law forbid, allow, or command the study of philosophy? Right? Because, of course, if it forbids it, done. خلاص. No one do philosophy, okay? اتفقنا. So he proposes it in the following statement. The if here is not a hypothetical if. It's more the Arabic إذا, i.e. given that. Right? So he writes, if the activity of philosophy is nothing more than study of existing beings and reflection upon them as indications of the artisan, right, the creator, and if the law has encouraged and urged reflection on beings, then, conclusion, it is clear that what this name signifies, philosophy, is either obligatory or recommended by law. All right? This is the most basic form of a logical syllogism, by the way. Two premises, conclusion. Right? Premise one, philosophy is nothing more than the study, la la la. Premise two, the law does command or at least, encourage this. Therefore, conclusion, such and so. Right? The most central premise of the two is the second one. Because, as I said, his main question is, what is the attitude of the law? So the question is, does the law, religious law, encourage and or urge reflection on beings? Question. Does it? What do you think? Does religious law command us to reflect on being, on creation, on mawjudat, on makhluqat? No? Yes? Abrar. Well, yeah, not language of right, but yes, yeah. I mean, absolutely. For Ibn Rushd, the answer is a clear yes. Yeah, absolutely. For Ibn Rushd, the answer is a clear yes, writing again as a jurist. Go ahead. Shara. Shara. Well, it's not government, but yes. No. He means the actual word of God. Well, for him, that's law. What men say is not. So he says, no, obviously there's very clear, don't take Ibn Rushd's word for it. Right? He's referencing the Quran. Right? And these are two examples of the verses he references and many other verses. Good? So he says, it's not about what I'm saying. It's about what religious law, i.e. the word of God, says. Right? Reflect, you have vision. Have they not studied the kingdom of the heavens and the earth and whatever things God has created? And other verses. Right? Now he says, if you look at this and you understand the tonality of these two, the first one is a command. Fa'al amr. It's not simply, it would be nice if you did. Right? The second one is more of it would be nice if you did. The second verse he's referencing is more of an encouragement. Right? The first one is more of a commandment. And again, remember, he's writing as a judge here, right? In jurisprudence, or at least in legal kind of decision making, if two things, if one thing is both commanded and encouraged, which is the higher one? The commandment, right? So he says, not only is it encouraged, it's actually commanded. Good? All right. شو خص الفلسفي? Because so far, all Ibn Rushd has shown us that the law commands us to reflect upon beings. Fine. How do you sneak philosophy? How do you get philosophy into there? Right? And Ibn Rushd says, well, let's figure out what reflection means here. And he says, reflection is nothing more than inference and drawing out the unknown from the known. And since this is reasoning, or at any rate done by reasoning, therefore, we are under an obligation to carry our study of beings by intellectual reasoning. Right? So we go from the law commands reflection to what is reflection? Well, reflection is inferring the unknown from the known. And for that, you need intellectual reasoning. Therefore, we need to do this through intellectual reasoning. Right? And the highest form of intellectual reasoning is demonstrative reasoning. القياس العقلي. The term reasoning is a throw-off, by the way, here. The Arabic he's using is القياس, which is syllogism, actually. It's not reasoning, but, you know, it gives you an idea. So it's intellectual reasoning is القياس العقلي. And he's using this as a direct comparison with القياس الفقهي, right? Which is legal reasoning. So if I'm going to do this by reference to intellectual reasoning, then I need to study intellectual reasoning. And I need to study the different methods of intellectual reasoning. And I need to study the different forms of intellectual reasoning. I need to know how to differentiate between a premise and a conclusion. I need to know how to formulate a valid argument, as we say in logic, right? Whereby the conclusion follows from the premises, etc. And to do that, well, I have kind of had to study Aristotle because he's the one, well, and others, because they set the books on how you do this, right? So you go from reflect, you have vision, to, okay, I guess I need to study the works of philosophy. All right? That is not to say in studying Aristotle or the Aristotelian tradition, I accept all their conclusions. I'm not interested in the conclusion. I'm interested in the method of intellectual reasoning. And this is a big issue for Ibn Rushd. Because Ibn Rushd and others can critique Aristotle for some of his conclusions. But the method itself, that's the method of intellectual reasoning, right? All x is y, a is an x, therefore a is, there's no other way to do this. Good? Sorry. So if we do this here, we need to start, as we said, to base ourselves on works that have already been done in the field. And this is something we do whatever the field. If you're studying mathematics, you don't start from zero. You start where others have done before you. If you're doing fiqh, you can do the same thing. Of course, you're going to do the same thing with the arts of arts, philosophy, san'at al-sana'a. So now we can, and this is the top of the second page on your fly sheet. You can more or less break down the reasoning he's led to. And of course, I've left out some details which you can look at, of course, more closely in your class discussions. So this is more or less the kind of flow of the reasoning that he undergoes, okay? So the first point is, as we said, he establishes the law, religious law, obliges the study of beings and reflection upon them, right? But then, as we said, but to do that, one needs to go into intellectual reasoning. One needs to study the forms of intellectual reasoning. So in order to do that, one has to study the rules and principles of reasoning. In order to do that, I'm at point 4 now, one has to study the works of those before us who have done work in these matters, right? Who have done work on how does one best perform intellectual reasoning, قياس العقل. Once I've done that, now I can go back to point 1, reflect upon beings from intellectual reasoning. And like any other field, one again doesn't start from zero. One starts from what's already been done in the field, and it's already been done in the field, and therefore, no, the conclusion now, the law obliges us to study philosophy. Because the law obliges us to study beings, and philosophy is the study of beings, therefore the law obliges us to study philosophy, right? Not allows, not encourages. He's very clear in his conclusion. مأمور به على جهة الوجوب. This is an obligation, right? Which is a bit scary for all of us who don't want to be anywhere near philosophy, right? So is Ibn Rushd now saying that everyone should study philosophy? Everyone must, مش may, must study philosophy in order to really fully commit oneself to one's faith? Of course, that's not what he's saying, right? Because like with everything else, Ibn Rushd believes that this field, this study, like anything else within the religious commandments, is for those who can, right? And this is not just true of the study of philosophy, this is true of pilgrimage for those who can. This is true of fasting for those who can, right? So what does it mean for those who can? How is it that some can and some can't? And according to Ibn Rushd, well, yes, there's certain differences in capacities, let's call them, right? And if you might now be thinking of Plato in your readings in this course, right? Not exactly Plato, but kind of resounding. Because he says, in a context of attacking those who forbid, he identifies the qualities. He says, so now he now turns the defense of the study of philosophy to an attack against those who stop me. Someone like Abu Hamid. Whoever forbids the study of them, i.e. the books of philosophy, to anyone who is fit to study them. Now we get the qualification. Who is fit to study them? I.e., anyone who unites two qualities. Natural intelligence, the Arabic he uses is ذكاء الفطرة, and two, religious integrity and moral virtue. So it's qualified. It's not everyone must study philosophy. Those who can must study philosophy. So if anyone stops someone like that from studying philosophy, is blocking people from the door by which the law summons them, etc. So he turns from a defense of the study of philosophy to an attack against anyone who would stop you. Right? Because in religious law, if somebody stops you from fulfilling a commandment, they are very much in the wrong. So if Al-Ghazali is stopping people from accessing books of philosophy, he is actually stopping them from fulfilling a divine commandment, which is kind of not nice to say the least. Right? So there's different natural capacities. So that's first point is very important. We'll get to it in a minute. But here there's a key question, a key question is, what is the basis by which you say someone can or can't, right? Is someone going to come up to me and tell me that I can? And that's not what Ibn Rushd is saying. Ibn Rushd is saying, you know, right? You know your inclination, your natural capacity, your dhaka al-fitra, or whatever you want to call it. And there's different capacities, let's call them, right? Not capacities as in capabilities. The idea that he's saying is, look, different people come to tasdeeq, come to assent, come to conviction through three different ways. Either through reasoning, or through good preaching, or through debate. Right? And so for those who can only come to tasdeeq, for those who can only come to assent through reasoning, they have to obey that commandment. That's their method, philosophy. Right? Others not necessarily. And of course, you know, he's like, on what basis do you divide these people into these three capacities, ya Abu Hamid? La, sorry, Abu al-Walid. Right? And he says, not me. Again, not me. The word of God. And he references again a verse. He says, God said, addressing the Prophet, summon to the way of your Lord by wisdom and by good preaching, and debate with them in the most effective manner. Right? Id'i ila sabili rabbika. Ibn Rushd reads this as three different ways. You can summon to the way of your Lord by wisdom, hikmah, by good preaching, khutaba, وَجَادِلْهُمْ بِالَّتِي هِيَ أَحْسَنُ, or debate with them. So it's not me, Ibn Rushd, saying there are three ways. Clearly there are three ways. Otherwise, why would God say, use one of these three ways? So if there are three ways, one of them is hikmah. It means some people naturally can only come to this through philosophy, and they are the ones who must study philosophy. Right? So now if you go back to the initial conclusion, slides ago. Right? You can rewrite that. The law obliges the study of philosophy to those who can. Right? So it's not a generalization, it's not a universal principle. Right? To those who can't, it's fine. There are other ways. Right? So in fact, Ibn Rushd wants to say, if you can, it is wrong if you don't, and if you can't, it is wrong if you do. Right? Good. Because, he says, at the end of the day, demonstrative study does not lead to conclusions conflicting with what Scripture has given us, for truth does not oppose truth, but accords with it and bears witness to it. This is at the heart of his argument. Right? Now, to get here, he anticipates counter-arguments, and you'll read them again closely in your class discussions, but I want to give you two quick examples. How is it he anticipates someone saying, Ibn Rushd, how can you say that the law commands the study of philosophy, when here, as I said at the very beginning, we mean falsafa, we mean Greek philosophy, when obviously this is a result of paganistic societies and paganistic people who don't share our religion? How can I base an argument that says God asks me, or the law asks me to study philosophy, when philosophy is non-Islamic, it's pre-Islamic, it's kind of paganistic? Right? Ibn Rushd responds saying, in his own way, shukhas, right? But in his own way. He says, I'm not asking you to take, remember, I'm not asking you to take the conclusions, I'm asking you to take the tool. And he gives us a very nice analogy from legal reasoning, qiyas al-fiqhi. He says, suppose it is time for sacrifice, al-adha, right? And it's very, very clear how one performs a sacrifice in an Islamic context, right? I have the thing to be sacrificed, but I don't have the tool. So I go to my neighbor and I borrow the tool. Now, my neighbor is Jewish. Does that in any way affect the act of the sacrifice? He says, absolutely not, because it doesn't matter where I got the tool from. What matters is that I performed the thing in accordance with the prescriptions of law and etc. He says, likewise, I'm not asking you to take Aristotle's conclusions and walk with them. I'm asking you to take the method, the tool. I don't care what their religious background is. It doesn't concern me. What concerns me is how I'm going to apply it and use it within the context of the world we're living in, right? And the questions we're asking. Good? Then he anticipates another. So suppose he convinces us. So, okay, fine, Ibn Rushd, good one. But can you deny that philosophy can lead into error? In fact, he can't, because he himself critiques philosophers that Al-Ghazali critiques, particularly Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, right? And so how can the law command us to study something that can lead into error? Ibn Rushd says, good question. Except, yeah, Abu Hamid, because that's a lotchi to Al-Ghazali, yeah? Because that's what Al-Ghazali, if you remember, says. The Falasifa commit 20 errors, 3 of which are the most serious, right? Because the Falasifa, according to Al-Ghazali, argue that the world is eternal, argue that, do you know the other 2? No? God's knowledge is of universals, not particulars, and argue that, or conclude that only the soul is resurrected on Judgment Day, not body and soul, right? And according to Al-Ghazali, these are accounts of unbelief, okay? So clearly there's error. And so Ibn Rushd says, there is error, but not in philosophy. He says, you have to distinguish between 2 qualities, generally, before we even speak about error. Certain qualities of anything we call accidental qualities, and certain other qualities we call essential. Are you familiar with this distinction? Right? Let's take a very basic example. The chairs you're sitting on, what color are they? Some kind of navy bluish shade. If they were a different color, would they still be a chair? So the color is not an essential quality. Right? It's what we call an accidental quality. So, if I'm sipping my coffee, and I am, and I choke and die, I'm not, would you stop people from drinking coffee?
But maybe we think that it's harmful for us.
Sorry?
Maybe we think that it's harmful for us.
Yeah, but what is harmful? What killed me? Was it the coffee? Is that what killed me? Does coffee kill? Right. So there was an accidental property. Something I choked. I'm about to shamil it. Right? Hada da'a alayya. I don't know. Right? So the point is, if on the other hand I were drinking poison and I died, we're like, oh, well, that was surprising. He drank poison. And no, I mean, that's what poison does. Poison kills essentially. Coffee, not coffee. But yes, I mean, you could. Right? So let's connect back to philosophy. Philosophy itself, no, is not essentially erroneous. But can I commit an error using philosophy? Yes. Can I commit an error doing medicine? Is there such a thing as malpractice? Yes. Do you stop medicine? No. Can I commit an error in fiqh? In religious jurisprudence? Yes. Can I commit an error in tafsir? Yes. Do you stop the science? No. Right? So likewise, can a philosopher or someone engaged in philosophy commit an error? Definitely. Is this philosophy's fault? Definitely not. And according to Ibn Rushd, this is what Al-Ghazali missed. Right? He recognized faults of falasifa, agreed. But that's not the fault of philosophy. Right? Again, you'll see a lot of this in there. And especially because he goes then to respond to each of Al-Ghazali's 3 counts. Right? So, yeah, Al-Ghazali, you think no, that's not what's happening. That's not what we're saying, etc. You misunderstood. Or maybe Al-Farabi committed a mistake, but that's not Falsafa's fault. That's Al-Farabi's fault. Right? Etc. Because, as I said, he is, as much as he is, I'm skipping this now, it's in your classes. As much as he is concerned with defending philosophy, he's also concerned with defending religion against possible harms of philosophy, right? One of the main things for him that could lead to harm is to public, because as we said, there's different levels of interpretive classes, right? There's those who respond to wisdom, those who respond to preaching, and those who respond to debate. One problem that has caused issues is when we make the demonstrative discussions, the discussions of rational discourse, public. Because then we're placing a particular kind of language in front of those who can't grasp it, and yes, that can lead to error, right? As he says, there are 4 causes of error. One of them is the lack of natural capacity. Good? So in this sense, he believes that Al-Ghazali is part of the problem, because what Al-Ghazali does in a public work, what he means by public here is using simplified language, using the public language. He's discussing issues of the demonstrative level. And so obviously that can confuse people and lead them to error. And then of course you say, Ibn Rushd, what are you doing? Aren't you like also publishing? Right? But he knows we were going to say that on April 8, 2019. So he says, if it were not for the publicity given to the matter and these questions which we have discussed, we should not have permitted ourselves to write a word on the subject. And we should not have had to make excuses to justify ourselves for writing these things to the interpretive scholars, because the proper place to discuss these questions is in demonstrative books. Right? So the idea here, I'm only responding to what's already publicized by Al-Farabi, by Ibn Sina, by Al-Ghazali. And that's why I said this is not one of his philosophical works, because that's not where he would put this. Right? This is one of his key works, his main works on philosophy. Right? And the main concern, as I said, this is not just a theoretical issue for him. There's serious concern. He is writing with a serious sense of urgency because he believes damage is actually being done to both philosophy and religion. Right? And you can see this very clearly in one of the closing sections of his work. He says, our soul is in the utmost sorrow and pain by reason of the evil fancies and perverted beliefs which have infiltrated religion. Note, particularly such afflictions as have happened to it at the hands of people who claim an affinity with philosophy. Right? And he gives examples in some of his other works. Because he believes that philosophy is one of the greatest, and you'll see this in your own discussions and readings, one of the greatest tools to illuminate, to clarify revelation. Right? So if philosophy is abused, or if philosophy commits error, it's not just harming philosophy, it's harming religion. Because the best way to understand religion, according to Ibn Rushd, Al-Farabi before him, Ibn Sina, many after them, the best way to enlighten religious teachings and revelation is through reasoning. Okay? So if I'm committing mistakes of reasoning, if I'm abusing my philosophical reasoning, then essentially I'm harming religion in as much as I'm harming philosophy. Injuries, he continues, from people related to philosophy are the severest to religion. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, it, i.e. religion, has also been hurt by a host of ignorant friends who claim an affinity with it. These are the sects which exist within it. Right? If you note from this is towards the end of his work, his main concern is not really philosophy in itself. Right? His concern is religion at the end. His concern is how do you protect the life of religion and the life of faith. Right? But of course not in a simplistic level. He's talking about the higher level. And for him to do so, one needs to clarify the place and role of philosophy. One needs to defend the place and role of philosophy, but one needs to properly use philosophy. Right? Because some of the greatest damage to religion can actually happen on the hands of the falasifa. And here he has in mind Ibn Sina and Al-Farabi. Not because Ibn Sina and Al-Farabi attacked religion, but because according to Ibn Rushd, they kind of misunderstood some things about Aristotle, and they applied those misinterpretations on their understanding of religion. And that's what got people like Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari and al-Ghazali to say, what the hell are you guys saying? Philosophy leads to unbelief. Right? And Ibn Rushd saying, no, it doesn't, but it can be harmful. Good? Many would say that Ibn Rushd is the last of the Arab Islamic philosophers. I really hate these words of first and last. I don't know who was first. I don't know who was last. But certainly, I'm not sure he deserves such an epithet of the last of the Arab Islamic philosophers. But he was certainly the most outspoken of the last in trying to say, if we are not careful about this, we're going to harm both. And many would say, whether you agree or not, both were actually harmed for quite a few centuries. And whether we need to revive some kind of rational reasoning today, whether we need to kind of bring back some sense of rational discourse or not, I don't know. I leave that up to you to decide and discuss. Thank you for your attention.